Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. We saw a skinwalker, submitted by Amoeba Man. Please don't think I'm crazy, because I'm not. But me and my brother and cousin saw a skinwalker when I was visiting them in Arizona. They're my cousins by marriage, not blood, and I am not native. I share in a lot of the traditions and such, but I'm as white as when white met bread. This was back in the 80s, and my family has long since left that area, but at the time, they lived in a town called Vernon on the Apache Res. My brother and sister and I lived with my parents in Bakersfield and would visit at least twice a year when I was growing up. I was 16 when what I'm sharing with you happened. It was Easter time, and we went out to celebrate with them, and my older cousin Hugh said we should go camping for a night at a lake about an hour away from their home. We begged and pleaded with our parents to go, and they finally said okay, but it was just me and my brother Ron and Hugh that were allowed to go. Hugh had this awesome old Jeep Scrambler that I loved riding in, and we quickly loaded up a bunch of stuff to camp, like a tent, stove, and stuff like that. We were psyched to be escaping the family for a night, and Hugh even sneaked some beer from the garage for us to have. At 16, I was feeling like an adult. We said goodbye to everyone and jumped in the Jeep and made the journey down to the lake campground. If you've never been out that way, let me tell you, there ain't shit out there once you leave a township. All the way to this lake, there was a whole lot of nothing. When we got there, the place was practically deserted. No one was there, and I guess maybe because of Easter, I don't know. The plan was to camp that Saturday night and be back for a big family meal that Easter Sunday. My cousins were very traditional, but also very religious too. So, we got a spot right on the lake's edge and put up the tent, and then went fishing right there at our site. We had stopped at a general store to get fishing permits for me and Ron, but Hugh already had his, and we spent the morning on this gorgeous lake fishing for trout, and Hugh said he'd show us how to make blue trout for dinner if we caught enough. We did catch enough, killed them humanely, and put them on ice in a bucket for later, and then we took a hike around the area watching out for spiders and snakes. Hugh was kind of like a god to me at this point in my life. I followed his lead with everything, from music to clothes. I mean, I loved my older brother, but Hugh just seemed to be larger than life. That trip, he amazed me by catching and holding these yellow scorpions without ever thinking they would sting him, and they didn't. That evening, we just hung out at our campsite, and Hugh did make blue trout and potatoes, and this is when things got kind of weird. Ron started asking Hugh about his thoughts on the universe and where we all fit in, and somehow that morphed into traditional native beliefs. We were all sipping on the beers and having a good conversation, but I got this feeling that something wasn't quite right. We had a nice campfire going, but I kept standing up and looking around, feeling like we were being watched. It was eerie, but I felt safe with Ron and Hugh. Around 10 o'clock, the beer made it to my zone and I had to take a pee, so I walked away from our camp to some trees and let the lizard spit. While I was going, I heard a noise to my right and looked over to see if it was a jackrabbit or something. But what I saw was not that simple. Standing about 50 feet from me was this tall and skinny man-beast, for lack of a better term. It looked kind of like a dog. I mean, it had a dog face, but the body was human and really skinny and gaunt. After a while of me staring at it, it must have gotten the idea that I was there, because it looked over at me and then dropped to all fours and sniffed the ground. But all the while, it never stopped looking at me. I stumbled back to the fire, scared out of my mind, and interrupted Hugh talking to my brother to say what I had just seen. Hugh looked at me deeply and turned off his tape player that had been playing The Doors. He asked me to describe it again, and just as I was doing that, there was a rustle in the gravel off to the side of our tent. We all looked over, and at first it looked like a coyote or something, but I knew what it really was. On the fringe of the firelight, the thing stood up on its hind legs again. It was bigger than I originally thought. I mean, it was looking at us from over the top of our tent. It started to make these weird coughing, growling noises, and it stalked around the tent to where we could see it clearly, as plain as day. Who told me and Ron to get into the scrambler, and he picked up a 5-gallon bucket of water. While we got into the Jeep, he poured the water on the fire and then made a dash for the door. The thing let out this terrifying shriek, and Who just jammed the key in and floored it out of the campsite. I looked back, and this dog thing was chasing after us. It was running at top speed, keeping up with us, and to my horror, it actually ran so quick, it was soon running alongside the Jeep. Who got us back onto the highway, and the thing that had been neck and neck with us, scratching its clawed hands out at the windows of the scrambler, soon faded off to the side and was gone from view. We sped all the way back to Vernon that night and burst in the door, scaring the hell out of everyone. My dad and uncle took us all out to the garage and asked what the heck was going on, and we told them, and they and Who all looked at one another and nodded. "You boys go get some sleep," my uncle said, "and don't talk about this with any of the rest of the family. We'll go out tomorrow before church and get your things that you left." We all went back inside and had hot chocolate and then went to bed. My dad and uncle went out really early the next morning to get our gear, and then they came home. They never once mentioned the beer cans they found. They just got our stuff, and that was that. Okay, where was I? Okay. We all went inside and had hot chocolate and then went to bed. My dad and uncle went out really early the next morning to get our gear and then came home. They never once mentioned the beer cans they found. They just got our stuff, and that was that. A few years later, Who was visiting us in Bakersfield on a job interview he had in L.A., and I asked him about that night. He said it was a skinwalker, and that they didn't like talking about them. He said skinwalkers were native shaman who could turn into animals and bring harm to people, and that we were lucky to have gotten out of that campground without trouble. When I asked him for more information, he just said to forget it, and not to worry. He then laughed and changed the subject. That's a hard request, though. I can't just forget about it. The sight of that thing, its teeth, its raggedy hair, and its clawing at our faces in the Jeep, will forever be etched in my mind. My Haunted House, submitted by Jazzy J. It started when I was 13. With a story as fantastic as this is, you'd think that what happened to my family would be a movie or a television special. All things being honest, we were approached by entertainment vultures about doing just that, and one of the groups was some people a lot of you would recognize. My dad saw through their bullshit and told them so to their face, that he knew they were charlatans and all of their so-called work was lies and nonsense. They didn't take that too lightly and threatened to sue us, but my dad and uncle basically laughed in their faces and said, "Sue us for what?" But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me back up. Thanks for sharing this story. I haven't told anyone else about this in years. It was 1986, just after my 13th birthday in October, when things began to happen in my house. At first, it was little stuff that just seemed like normal house noises, and my parents chalked it up to the place settling. The house was about 60 years old, built in the 1920s and in addition to an older neighborhood in the village of our town. Basically, the main street of the neighborhood was there, but in the 20s, a farmer sold a bunch of his land and a U-shaped street was put in. Houses went in, and my parents bought the place from the original owner in the late 70s. It was a 2-story house with a semi-finished basement and a 3rd-floor attic that was a walk-up but was only used for storage. There were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom on the 2nd floor. All of the rooms were at the end of a hallway, with the 2 rooms in the front of the house and my room in the back. I hope this makes sense as far as layout goes. Keep it in mind as I explain what happened over the years I lived there. I grew up with an older sister who graduated high school when I was 12. I teased my parents that I was a whoops baby, but that wasn't true at all. I was planned. So, a lot of what I went through will sound like I was an only child, but that's not the case. My sister, I'll call her Jen, was away at college most of the time. When I was in 6th grade, I started writing and keeping a journal off and on, as well as a tape-recorded journal. I still have some of those cassettes, and not all of them have to do with the paranormal stuff that happened, but some do. The paper journals did, but they have long since disappeared. But I had them into my early 30s, and some of the entries I had memorized. And as I was saying, it was just after my birthday. I was sitting in my room listening to my new Duran Duran tape, Notorious, and I was waiting for my friend Jason to come over. It was a Saturday, and he was going to stay overnight as his parents were going out of town, and we had plotted to sneak over to this girl's house that I liked, and her friend was staying overnight there too. Jason finally got there, and we went up to my attic to smoke a cigarette and talk about our plans. We often snuck up there as the staircase went up there from my bedroom, and other than storage, no one ever went up. I had a kind of a fort up there with an old TV and my Atari. After we had a smoke, we went back down to my room, and that's when we heard the footsteps up above us. I looked at Jason and he said, "Shit, was someone up there the whole time?" I said, "No way." And we listened again, and this time the footsteps came from the other side of the attic. But they were there. I jumped up and flew up the stairs with Jason right behind me. We searched the entire place, but there was no one up there. I checked the windows. Both were locked, and we had only cracked them for the smokes. The screens were still on. I shrugged, and Jason started walking towards me to go back down to my room, when this old dress form my mom had up there started shaking and rocking back and forth. It was between the two of us, and rather than freeze, Jason ran right past it as it slid across the floor from one eave to the other. We never screamed or said a word. We just ran down the stairs into my room, and I shut the door. For a few minutes, I stared at my fish tank before Jason finally said, "We really just saw that, right?" For a second, I thought maybe our minds were playing a trick on us. So I went back up there, saw the dress form lying on its side, and had the biggest shiver run down my spine. We both felt like getting out of the house, and it was pretty nice out for a fall day, so we decided to go into the village and skateboard and see if anyone else was around. Some other friends were there, and Jason blurted out the whole story to them, and almost all of them got big eyes. We all skated for a while, and it got close to supper time, so we started to take off, but my other friend Simon asked if he could see the ghost, and I told him there wasn't one, just something really freaky happened. He kept asking and had to go our way home to get to his, so finally I said fine. The three of us went to my house, went up to my room, and we all just stood there. Simon went to the attic door and opened it, and out fell the dress form right into my room. We all jumped and ran downstairs until my father yelled to slow down and knock it off. We did, and Simon just said he had to go. Nothing else happened over the weekend. We did sneak out to see the girls, and we told them, but Monday at school we found out pretty fast that Simon had told a bunch of other people that we had tried to scare him, and that we set up the dress form on purpose. I told him that was stupid, and I hadn't planned on anyone coming over to my house other than Jason, so he was full of it. Most people believed me, but for a long time, he brought it up that I was just trying to scare people. That week, I went to the school library and asked the librarian for books about ghosts, and she got me what the school had, and then told me to check out the information in encyclopedias. After school, I went to my public library and did the same thing. I'll totally admit, I was a total book geek and still am. I loved going to the library and was there multiple times a week. So I brought all this stuff home, and it didn't take long for my parents to ask me why I had all these books on ghosts and stuff. I lied and said it was a research project for English or something. I didn't tell them about what Jason and I heard and saw. I read a lot of things, and a lot of those stories I still remember. One of the books was called Haunted Houses, and it had a bunch of stories, one that sounded a little like what happened to me. I've looked for the book and found it on Amazon. It's by Larry Kettlecamp. It reads for a little kid, but it's still a pretty decent book. For the next couple of nights, I was up late reading the books and articles, oddly enough up in my attic fort. For some reason, I was scared, but was also curious to see if anything else happened. It didn't those nights, and it didn't for a few months at all. Right before Christmas, I was wrapping gifts for my family when I heard the footsteps above me again. Sitting and listening, the steps turned into a tapping on the door right near me. It was a light tapping, like just a finger tapping over and over. It wasn't like a greeting or a knocking, just this constant tapping. My sister was home from college and came by my room, and I asked her to come in. She asked what was up, and I said, "Just listen." She heard the tapping and looked at me with big eyes, but then frowned, and I could tell she thought I was about to pull a prank on her. I put my hand up and shook my head, and then the footsteps started walking across the attic again. I got up, pushed her lightly into the hallway, and then went into her room. Before she could say anything, I whispered to her what had happened with Jason, and that I wasn't kidding around or trying to fool her. We sat there listening to the footsteps walk around on the ceiling in her room, too. At first, she didn't buy it and asked me who was up there, but I told her over and over it wasn't me, and it was real. Everything stopped, and she asked if Mom and Dad knew about this. I said no, and we talked about telling them. I didn't want to and convinced Jen we shouldn't until something else happened and they could hear or see it. I recalled how some people didn't believe me. Christmas Eve came, and that's when my parents found out for themselves. Christmas Eve, we always went to church with my grandparents, and then everyone stayed at our house. We got to open one present before going to bed, and I remember I was so excited that my dad bought me a new book about ghosts. I should be clear at this point. My mom did not like me reading that stuff, but my dad was always humoring me. Late that night, we all went to bed. Jen was sleeping in my room, my grandparents slept in my parents' room, and my parents were in Jen's. I offered to sleep in the attic and assured my mom that it wasn't too cold. Honestly, I wanted to have a few more smokes and read some of my new book. My parents let me, and I got into my sleeping bag with a little space heater going. I was toasty and fell asleep, and I didn't know what time it was, but suddenly I was being picked up and carried down the stairs into the bright light, and when I was blinking, I saw everyone out in the hallway in their pajamas and bathrobes. I looked up at my dad, and his eyes were big, and he just asked if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, why?" And he just took me into Jen's room, laid me down on the floor, and said to go back to sleep. I did, and the next thing I knew, it was Christmas morning. Everyone was gathered downstairs for presents and breakfast before all the other relatives were coming over. Everyone was smiling and laughing and wishing everyone Merry Christmas, but I got the feeling something was wrong as everyone kept asking if I was okay, and I could feel everyone looking at me. Mom let me have eggnog that early in the morning, and I had fun giving and receiving presents. One that I got was a new boombox that had the double cassette players and a microphone and a bunch of blank tapes. I don't think I need to tell any 70s or Gen Xers listening to this how mind-blowing that was back then. I mean, mixtapes and copying tapes was the best way to get music back then. So, anyway, whatever had happened the night before I wasn't concerned with, and it was a cool morning. Dad pulled me aside later and asked me to help him with something in his wood shop in the basement. I went down there with him and he closed the door and said, "Can you tell me what happened last night?" I just looked at him, and I remember being really scared that my parents had found my cigarettes and I was going to be in deep shit. When I said, "I don't know what you mean. Did I do something wrong? I thought I turned the TV and Atari off." He just looked at me and said, "No, son. Did you hear or see anything last night while you were up in the attic?" I was relieved my smokes were safely stashed in my ball card box. I said I didn't notice anything except him carrying me downstairs. There was a knock on the door, and in came my mom. She looked at my dad with a worried expression, and he shook his head. I finally said, "Is this about what Jason and Jen and I know?" They both looked at me, and I spilled everything that had happened. I explained about the books and what happened with Jen, too. They just stood there looking at me, and then got up and gave me a hug and told me there was nothing to be frightened about, and I wasn't in trouble. Jen told me later that day that during the night, there had been massive thumps on the floor coming from the attic, and the sound of something clomping on the attic floor really fast back and forth. It woke everyone up, it was so loud, but I never heard a thing. They all thought it was me running around as a joke or something, but when my dad came upstairs, everything stopped, and there I was, completely asleep, snug in my sleeping bag. My dad told me to stay out of the attic for a little while, but when Mom was getting ready in the bathroom and Dad was in the shower, I ran up to get my stash of smokes and had one more in the window. By the way, if anyone is thinking about it, my mom and grandparents all smoked, so the smell was pretty much around all the time. They never noticed I was smoking. Things were fine for a long time and nothing happened. But right around Memorial Day, things started up again. I played drums in the marching band, and we had a parade that weekend. On the Friday before, we had off from school and I was home alone doing some rudiments on my practice pad in the basement. I thought I heard my dad upstairs yelling out, so I stopped and went up to the steps and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm down here." There was nothing. I looked outside and my parents' cars weren't in the driveway, but I checked the house anyway. When I got to the second floor, I heard a deep whooshing sound coming from my parents' bedroom, like a car going by you in the rain. You know that sound? Then I heard it, my name being whispered. "Patrick." I said, "Dad?" And I slowly walked to the room. Everything was quiet. Then I heard a deep voice say, "You." I ran into my room and slammed the door shut. I was very scared and didn't know what to do. It was one thing to hear footsteps, but the voice scared the crap out of me. There was some booming noises coming from the attic, like books being dropped on the floor, and I made a break for it out of my room. I wanted to get downstairs and call my friend Jeff, who lived right up the street. He came over and I told him what was going on. He knew about the other stuff and wouldn't come inside, and said we should just shoot hoops in the driveway for a while. We did, and it made me feel better. When my mom got home from work, I started to tell her about what had happened, and she told me to stop talking nonsense, and it was coming from all those books I was reading, and that was making me make things up. I told her the books were not making me make things up, and then I said, "What happened to Christmas?" She got mad and said to stop it, and then told me to go to my room. I was 13, but I still listened to my mom. I'm sure there was plenty more backtalk and me being pissed off at her. But I remember going up there and starting my recording on my boombox about how mad I was and how it was bullshit that she was blowing all of this stuff off. That's one of the tapes I still have. It's actually pretty funny to hear it now. My dad got home and I could hear them talking, and my mom's voice rising every once in a while. One thing that stuck with me for a while was her saying, "That's not the household I want here." She sounded really mad. Things got quiet, and I heard my dad coming upstairs. I knew he wanted to talk to me. He was really cool about things, and just told me to come to him if something weird was happening, and that Mom was under a lot of stress right now with work. She was still upset my sister was gone to college or something like that. I knew my dad was taking everything I had said more seriously, so I agreed with him. That's when shit really started going off the rails. Our TV that had been working fine started turning itself on and off at all hours, and after looking at it himself and taking it to a repair place, we found there was nothing wrong with it. We had just gotten cable, and the main dial had to be on 3 for the TV to work, but one evening the dial itself started spinning on its own, and my mom just got up and went into the kitchen. The back door started opening by itself in the middle of the night, and we could all hear footsteps going through the house, upstairs and down, and then out through the front door, which slammed each time. Each time, my dad would run down there with his .45, but there was never anyone there. He did call the cops one time, but they found nothing and told us to just change our locks. We did, but it still happened. I talked about this on my tapes and in my journal. One weekend in the summer, we went to Jeff's parents' place at a lake for some boating and fishing, and it was awesome. When we got home, our neighbors seemed surprised to see us, especially me. They thought I was home because the last 2 nights they said there were crazy lights and screams in our house, and they thought I was watching scary movies while my parents were away. My parents looked at each other, and they just said that they would look into it. That never happened when we were home. Then, one night not much later, I woke up in the night to loud banging and my mother screaming. My dad started yelling and then trying to get my mom to calm down through the banging, and I ran into the hallway to see the foot of their bed being lifted and then dropped. As soon as I came into the room, it stopped, and that voice again came and said, "You." My mom started crying, and Dad said we should all go downstairs. Jen slept through the whole thing. The next morning, my mom went somewhere early. It was a Saturday because she didn't go to work, and my dad said we needed to clean the house and go grocery shopping. I asked about Mom, and he said she was seeing some friends. Mom didn't come back that day, and I had Jeff and Jason come over to watch some movies, just trying to have a life. I asked if they could stay over, and my dad said fine, and we planned to stay up in the attic and see if we could record any of the weird stuff happening. Again, funny how one minute I could be so scared, and the next so curious and brave. So, we were all up there late that night. It was right before school was starting again, so it was pretty warm up there, and I had a couple of fans going to cool things down. We were trying to get Saturday Night Live on my little TV when Jeff said he thought he heard something. I turned the TV off, and Jason turned on the boombox. At first it sounded like papers rustling in the corner behind some boxes. Then we heard the tapping and what sounded like something being stuck in one of the fans. We all looked at each other with wide eyes, and Jason said, "Who is that?" Suddenly, the door from my room ripped open and loud footsteps came racing up the stairs. It was my dad. "What the hell's going on up here? You guys okay?" He was frantic. We all nodded, and he said to come with him. We did, and he led us outside onto the patio to wait for him. The police came a few minutes later, and my dad went inside with them, and they were in there for a long time. The three of us just sat out there wondering what the hell was going on. Finally, they all came out. The police left, and my dad said to come back inside. A few minutes later, Jeff and Jason's dads showed up, and they took them home despite our protests. My dad gave me the "kid, shut the F up" look, and I did. I didn't know what happened that night until much later, but while we were upstairs, something down on the first floor was having a field day. Dad had fallen asleep watching TV and woke up to all the dining room chairs sliding back and forth from under the table and all the lights flicking on and off. The TV dial was spinning out of control, and then our record player turned itself on. He took one look at all that stuff and then came upstairs to get us. He called the police when we were safe. No one was in the house. There was no explanation from the cops. When it was just me and him, he grabbed a beer and I asked him what was going on. He said he didn't know. I asked him where Mom was, and he sighed and said she was staying with my grandparents for a bit and that she wasn't feeling well. Actually, they had been fighting about a lot of things, this crazy stuff included. Sadly, this was the beginning of Mom's deterioration from mental illness that we never really knew she had. She'd been suffering since she was a kid, but had never been diagnosed. I guess Dad had wanted to get help from somewhere, the church, anywhere, but she was against it and wanted to pretend none of what was happening was real. Turns out, she saw and heard a lot of other things when we weren't around, but never said anything. That didn't help her state of mind. So, finally, my dad began to look for help. My uncle came to stay with us. He was a bachelor and had just gotten out of the service, and Dad invited him to live with us for a bit. I was happy. Uncle Tom was awesome. Our pastor came out and talked to Dad and I and said prayers in the house, but seemed more intent on talking about my mom, and Dad and I would wander from those talks. Uncle Tom wanted to know what I thought about all this spook business, as he called it. I could tell at the beginning he wasn't buying any of the weird stuff. That changed pretty fast. On the second night he was with us, he was staying in Jen's room. She had gone back to college happy in a way to get away from this and the issues with my mom. Their relationship went from best friends to cats and dogs real fast. Uncle Tom woke up in the middle of the night to my sister's closet door opening and closing on its own. He said he just stared at it for a minute before it slammed open all the way, and a dark shape filled the frame. He said he got up and ran at the thing, but the door closed, and when he threw it back open, thinking it was me or my dad messing with him, He found there was nothing in the closet. But he said he did hear a whispering, and that was when he realized we were not making it up, and that something was wrong. More stuff happened, like noises and doors opening and lights going on and off, and the neighbors started noticing things too. Jeff and Jason's parents were informed of what was up too, as my friends were over all the time, and they told them of the strange happenings. When we weren't home, our neighbors would watch the house light up at night and hear screaming and loud voices coming from inside. Somehow, it got to the local newspaper, and my dad said he would be willing to tell the story about the house if my neighbors would weigh in so he didn't look crazy. A photographer even took a photo of the house at night, and you could see some lights on, but we weren't home that night. A lot of people said it was a hoax, but no one ever gave us a hard time about what we said had happened there. Our neighbors were awesome as well. By this time, my mom was in a special hospital for treatment, and she didn't play a role in much else after that. It was very hard for all of us to not have her around, and it made me grow up fast in a lot of ways. For one thing, despite my football and classes, I was now taking care of the house while Dad worked. I made dinner and lunches and got stuff done around the house like the laundry and cleaning. One day after practice, I was home making dinner and having a cigarette, and Dad walked in. He never even asked why I was smoking. He just said, "Those'll kill you, kid." I was 14 going on 20. So you can tell things were a little different in our household. The objects moving around, the chairs sliding back and forth, the strange voices, all of it kept going, and we almost became used to it. That's when I go back to the beginning of this story. It's when the fraudsters showed up. I'm not going to say who it was because I don't need any trouble, but I'm sure a lot of people would know who I'm talking about. At first, my dad was nice and invited them in, but pretty quickly he could tell something wasn't right. They walked around and would just say things like, "Yep, demon," and then keep walking. One of them went into a trance and started talking about the many spirits in the house. After a while, we all sat down at the dining room table, and they said we had like 4 presences in the house, 3 women and 1 evil man, or a demon, and he was the one causing all the bad things, while the women were just making themselves known. They said they could help us clean the house, but had some odd demands that I've now forgotten. But I do remember looking at my uncle, who couldn't stop smiling the entire time. My dad told him that he would think over their offer, that involved more publicity, more people in the house to document things and things like that. When they left, Uncle Tom burst out laughing and said they were so full of shit their eyes were brown and their breath was bad. He didn't doubt there was something paranormal going on, but he pointed out that the people wanted a lot of their own recognition over finding out what was really going on. That night was a crazy one. It was towards the end of October, and it was getting cool at night. It was about 2 years since everything had started. I had a football game that my dad and uncle and new girlfriend went to, and afterward we went home and Chrissy and I were going to walk back into the village to a pizza place to hang out with our friends. When I brought her back to our house, there were people outside our house with all these lights flicking on and off in the windows, and these loud noises and yells coming from inside. I ran up the driveway to the front door and burst inside to my dad and uncle asleep in chairs watching TV. All the sounds and lights had stopped. They'd never noticed a thing. We couldn't explain it. I went back outside and told everybody that my father and uncle were watching a movie, but they were watching and Chrissy was freaked out, so I just walked her home. When I got back to the house, I was having a smoke and noticed the fraudsters had suddenly shown up and started talking to me about how they could help, but we would have to want to help ourselves. That's when the guy let it slip about making money along the way. I just said, "Hey, it's my dad's decision," and when I told them that, they left. They showed up again the next day, and this was after my dad had visited my mom and he was in a bad mood. They started harassing him as he got out of his car and tried to get into the house, and he finally told them to get the fuck off the property and not come back. My dad really didn't swear, so to hear him say that, I knew he meant it. He told them that he knew that they were liars and to get the hell out of there. Uncle Tom heard what was going on, came out and physically started to push them back onto the sidewalk. They went nuts and started saying all this stuff about how they were going to expose us and that they were going to sue us. Expose us for what, I thought. They were the ones wanting to exploit us. And sue us? For what? The once composed guy was now yelling and swearing and pointing at us, so we all just went inside. Halloween was when it all came to a head. Our house was really popular because people had heard about what was going on, and they came by for treats and also wanting to see if they could see something scary. I have to admit, everyone in our town was really cool about what happened, and no one ever gave us a hard time. It was nothing like the pitchfork and torch stuff you see in movies with people wanting other neighbors to leave. That night, after everyone had finally gone inside and stopped trick-or-treating, Chrissy and I decided to start watching a movie. I'll never forget, it was Invaders from Mars. We were eating popcorn on the couch, and she was nervous about being there, but I told her it would be okay if I was with her. My dad and Uncle Tom were downstairs with us, and that was the rule. No lights out and alone time with my girlfriend just yet. We were all laughing at how silly the 1950s movie was when I heard the footsteps up 2 stories and knew something was about to happen. I saw my dad looking up the stairs, and we heard a door creak open in the hallway. Footsteps came closer to us, and everything got really quiet. For the first time, I saw something I still can't explain. This black, grayish mist came down the stairs and into the living room in front of us. It just floated there, from the floor to the ceiling. We all saw it, and we all stared at it. Chrissy started crying, and I held her. Another mist, this one lighter, came from the dining room and stood there, and we could hear this whispering, but not make out what was being said. Then the 2 mists sort of blended together and went out of the room. Uncle Tom jumped up and went after it and was gone for a minute. He came back in the room and wanted to talk to my dad. Chrissy was a wreck, and I was worked up too. I needed to get out of the house, so I took her home and stayed at her house for a while. Her parents were aware of our house and were concerned about their daughter being there at all, and I understood. When I went home, my dad and Uncle Tom were up talking, and I hung out with them asking what had happened. Uncle Tom said the shape had gone out in the backyard and disappeared under a crabapple tree. Nothing else happened that night or for the next 2 months. By now I was playing basketball and just out of the house a lot, just practicing or at the boys' club putting in overtime, anything to be out of the house. It was right before Christmas that the decision was made that my mom would not be coming home, and she needed to live in assisted living. This literally crushed me and my dad, and it was the beginning of a very, very hard time. Dad sold the house, we moved to a different neighborhood, and that was that. A nice family moved in our old house, and as far as I know, nothing ever happened, although they did take out the crabapple tree and found a bunch of women's jewelry buried there. It certainly wasn't ours. Mom died in 1991, the year I graduated high school. Dad and I don't talk about this very much, but once in a while we'll recount something and laugh a little. I guess there's that. I think he thought whatever was there did something to push my mom over the edge, and he had some pretty wild stories he came up with, including an unhappy female ghost that he says saw my mom was happy and was determined to ruin her life. I'm not so sure about that theory. All I know is I saw and heard some pretty incredible things that others can corroborate. Ghosts, psychic energy, powers from beyond? I don't know. But here I am. It took me 4 nights to type this out. Thanks for reading it. Good night. The Train, submitted by Mini Me. Before I get into this, I want to stress how stupid this was, and this story should not encourage anyone to try something this dangerous and reckless. One evening in the early 90s, my friend Chuck and I were just wandering around the green space behind our neighborhood with no real aim to do anything. We were just following the train tracks that ran through that part of town, and we were talking. We heard and saw a train coming and got off the tracks as we had always been told that the conductors would shoot rock salt at anyone on the rail beds. I never saw that happen, but it was one of those urban legends, I guess, that we all believed. Still walking along the edge of some trees that lined the tracks, the train went past and then started to slow down. This was pretty normal, as the train ran right through our little village and had to lower their speeds as they went through. It was basically at a crawl when Chuck said, "Hey, do you want to hop it?" Being a stupid 14-year-old, I thought it would be cool, but then asked how far did he think it would go before slowing down again for us to jump off. Plus, I asked, how the heck are we going to get back home? Chuck told me that his brother and friends had did it once before, and the trains always slowed down outside another village about 10 miles away. It didn't go through the town, but skirted the outside of it. We could ditch there and then walk back in a couple of hours. I thought about it for a minute. It was summer, we were bored, and I thought, what the hell, let's go for it. We waited until we knew about half of the train was going across Main Street in the village, as this would be the slowest it would move. Chuck ran up to a car that looked like it had an open top, like a scrap hauler. I was jogging along, he jumped onto a ladder on the side in between the cars, and I did the same when he went up a couple of rungs. When he got to the top, he said the car was empty and went over the side and into it. I did too, and the next thing I knew, we were standing in the empty car laughing and walking the length of it. We knew we had to stay low until the train got out of town, and it was a weird feeling to be in there and moving. Eventually, the train picked up speed and got rolling pretty quick. We took turns climbing up the little handholds on the inside of the car and looking out at the scenery flying by. About 15 minutes went by, and Chuck and I thought something was wrong. At the speed we were going, we certainly should have arrived at the other town by now. He climbed up top again, and after a minute or so, he yelled back, "Oh, shit!" and he jumped down. "What's up?" I asked. "We didn't slow down at Marksville." I made the name of that town up, but you get the idea. I just looked at him dumbfounded. This was certainly not our plan. At first, we just stood there, and it sank in. We had no idea when this thing would slow down again. Chuck just stood there saying, "Fuck, fuck, 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 fuck," and I was losing my cool too. But I realized that it had to slow down or stop sometime. I just didn't know when. I got a cigarette out of my pocket and sat down with my back to a wall. I told Chuck to think of all the larger towns we'd go by before hitting the state line, and which ones might have stops or rail yards or whatever, and there were only 2 we could think of, and the first one about 80 miles away. "This has to stop at one of them," I told Chuck. "We might just have to ride this out." That's when I looked up and noticed the clouds forming, and things getting much darker. Over the roar of the train, once in a while I was catching thunder. A storm was coming, and we were going to be riding right through it out in the open. Chuck stared up his fuck chant again, and I told him to try to relax. If we could just sit tight for an hour and a half, we should be okay. Then the sky opened up, and it was nothing but flashes of lightning and rain pouring down with the wind now even stronger. We put our backs against the front wall to shield some of the weather, and it worked a little, but now we were soaked, getting cold, and of course now it was night. We kept going, and I was getting scared that this conductor had no intention of stopping any time soon, and pretty quick we'd be hours and hours from home. We didn't want to risk popping up to see if we could tell where we were in the storm, certainly didn't want to slip on the metal handholds. And then it happened. We could feel the train slowing down, and we both breathed a sigh of relief and hoped it would slow down enough for us to ditch without killing ourselves on the rocks next to the tracks. After about 15 minutes, we were at a crawl, and we knew we had to make a break for it. One by one, we climbed up and out of the car, made our way down and ready to jump. To be honest, that was the scariest part of all for me. With everything wet from the rain, all it would have taken was one slip, and we'd be dead for real. We got down, Chuck jumped first, then me, and we made our way to a tree line and stopped just inside. We had another smoke to calm down, and I said we should just walk with the train to see if there was a crossing that it was slowing down for, and in about 10 minutes we came to a paved road. There was a sign that said Tulbury 3, and we began to follow its direction, and once we were into this town, we found a McDonald's and went to the payphone. I called my mom, and she was not happy to say the least. She said she'd come and get us, but it was going to be a while. We were 90 miles from home. To wrap this up, the second scariest thing happened after we waited in that McDonald's. My mom didn't pick us up. My dad did, with Chuck's dad too. My dad had a friend who had been killed by a train when he was a kid, and let's just say the two of us got the Red Foreman foot in the ass in the parking lot and all the way home. Jesus, we were stupid for doing that. To everyone listening, don't mess around on trains. If you're lucky, you'll only get your ass kicked. Driving Cross Country, submitted by Terry from the Block. Back in 2009, I decided I was tired of my day job and wanted a change of scenery from the cold doldrums of Newark, New Jersey. I spoke with some friends from college that were living in San Francisco, and they convinced me to go out west too. I could crash with them as long as I liked until I found a job. So, from Thanksgiving time to March, I saved all of my money, did the nothing but ramen thing, then loaded up my hand-me-down Ford Explorer and planned my drive across the states. My father had bought me a Thule carrier for the roof, so with my little U-Haul trailer, I had everything all set to go, and I planned on sleeping in the back of the Explorer a couple of nights to save money. I didn't tell anyone I was going to do that, let alone my parents, who would have freaked out at that possibility. Before I go any further, I should let everyone know that I'm a petite female, 5'5", and weigh about 110 pounds. I was an avid runner back then and still am now, and was and am in very good shape if I do say so myself. I did a lot of kickboxing and training at the gym, so I thought if I did get into trouble, I'd be able to take care of myself. Back to the story. My plan was to head south first and then drive across through Tennessee, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, and then head up through Southern California. It was adding about 10 hours of time to the drive, but I figured I'd stop and see things on the way and just kind of take my time. On my first leg, I drove to Roanoke, Virginia, and stopped for the night. Not a problem at all. I found a hotel that seemed like a decent spot to park in for the night, and then I walked to a local restaurant, got something to eat, cleaned up in their bathroom, and then crashed in my truck listening to the rain on the roof. The next day, I made for Memphis, and I figured I'd stop there, maybe see Graceland, and then get a room for the night, and that's exactly what I did. About 9 hours on the road, and I was getting sick of being in the car, and I drove by Graceland. It was too late to stop in, so I found myself at a Motel 6, and here is where the trouble began. Right away, I knew something was wrong with the place. I mean, it was seedy, and I mean seedy. What can you expect from a place like that, right? But it wasn't until too late that I thought something was wrong. I got some more food and found that the back door to the building wasn't locked at all. I mean, it was wide open. Some security. I went to the front desk to tell them that this was unacceptable, but no one there spoke very good English, and I just gave up and went to my room and turned all the locks I could on and then pushed a chair up against the door. I knew what kinds of people were probably staying at a cheap-ass joint like this. The next morning, I got up early, showered, and was going to get on the road right away. But there was an issue. There was this guy standing by my truck looking into the windows. Not being a shy girl, I walked right up to him and asked him what he was doing. He jumped a little and then turned around. Then he smiled at me and said he liked my truck. I said, "That's nice," and then asked him to back away from it and told him that I was in a hurry. I took a good look at him as he stepped away with his hands up to his chest. "Sorry, pretty lady. No offense. Hey, can I buy you breakfast?" he asked. He was about 6 feet tall, dark hair, dark complexion, thin and not unattractive, but he just seemed weird. I mean, staring into my truck like he was going to break into it and then ask me to breakfast just made things even stranger. I politely said, "No thanks," and just got behind the wheel and started to drive off. He sort of stood off to the side and waved at me, and I watched him continue to look at me in my side view mirror. Oh well, I thought as I pulled onto the road, some local goofball, whatever. I stopped for gas and got back on the highway and put some miles in. I finally stopped in Sallisaw, Oklahoma to stretch, get some food and gas, and my friend Gene called me and asked where I was, and we chatted for a few minutes, and while I sat in my truck eating, I looked over and couldn't believe my eyes. Standing by the edge of the parking lot next to a dirty white car was the guy from the Memphis parking lot. He was looking at a map spread out onto the hood of his car, but every once in a while, he looked up at me, or at least in the direction of my truck. He couldn't see me face to face, but he was definitely looking in my direction. I told Jean about him, and she said I was probably mistaken and was just creeped out about the meeting that I had with him in the morning. When I looked over again, the car was there, but the guy wasn't. I agreed with Jean that it was probably just a silly coincidence, and maybe it was just someone else that looked like that guy. Got some more gas, and then got back on the interstate. I wasn't tired, and after 1 or 2 more pit stops, I made it to Amarillo and planned on sleeping in the back of the truck again. I wrote an email to my parents saying something about how fast it went from being the start of spring in one area to the brown of Texas in the next instant. I was shot, so I drifted away and didn't wake up until about 2 in the morning. That's when I heard something right outside of my truck. I was parked in an Embassy Suites this time to avoid the creep factor or a cheap place, but that didn't help things at all. I opened my eyes to see a flashlight pointing in on me, and I immediately screamed. The light didn't go out for a second, and I thought maybe it was hotel security or the police. But then the light turned off, and whoever was out there bumped the side of my truck as they turned around, and I saw a tall, dark shape run away and then under a parking lot light. Yeah, it looked like that guy. I freaked out, scrambled to put my sneakers on. I was only wearing a t-shirt and a pair of Umbro soccer shorts, and I felt so violated and naked, wondering how long that person was staring in at me. I thought of the guy as I pulled out of the parking lot, and after a few minutes, I pulled over and called Jean. She was still up and hanging out with my other friends, and I told them all what had happened. I was too keyed up to go back to sleep, so I made for Albuquerque, about 4 hours or so away by Chris's MapQuest search that he did on his laptop for me. On the way there, I stopped once for coffee and gas, but there wasn't a lot of traffic on Interstate 40. I was trying to calm myself down and reassure myself that it was probably just security that looked in on me, and then they got scared when I screamed. But suddenly, a car behind me came up with its brights on. They were right in my side view mirror, and I had to dodge my head over to get the light out of my eyes. Whoever this was stayed behind me for about 5 miles, and by that time I was yelling out curse words and telling him to turn his effing brights off. I slowed down, and the car slowed down too. I started to pull over to give this person even more room to pass if that's what he wanted to do, so it wasn't an issue, but suddenly the car sped right past me. It was the white car I had seen at the Sonic. I was sure of it. I waited a few minutes and then started driving again, really freaking out. I got out my phone and dialed Jean again, and I was so busy freaking out on her that I didn't notice the white car had slowed down and now I was passing it. The car got behind me again, and of course, on came the brights. Now I was really panicking, and I didn't know what to do. After about 10 minutes of me screaming and crying to Jean, the car again went around me and sped into the distance, and I took the next exit to a Flying J, hoping to throw this person off. There was a police car in the lot, and I went right over to him and blathered out my story. The police officer was very nice and listened to me and asked a lot of questions. Where I was from, where I was going, who I knew was out here, stuff like that. Even down to had I been drinking or doing any drugs. He decided that I hadn't been and suggested I get a room in town. He radioed a description of the car out to all the other officers so they would be aware of what was going on, and he led me to a Holiday Inn, and I got a room after parking in the back. The officer said he'd follow up with me later, and Jean called me back and I told her where I was and then just crashed. I woke up in the morning and called my parents and let them know what was going on, and the officer came to the hotel before he went off shift and said that they hadn't seen anything and that I was probably okay to keep moving. I went to get some food, and when I got back to my truck, on the windshield written in what I think was toothpaste were the words, "Nice try." I freaked the hell out and called the police again. They came out, took pictures of my windshield, and made me do a formal statement. I didn't know whether to scream or cry or what. I called my parents again, and my dad wanted to come and get me, but ended up buying a plane ticket for Jean to fly to Albuquerque and then finish the drive with me. Somewhat calmer, I asked the police officer about a different place to spend the night before driving to Albuquerque, and they said to leave my truck at the Holiday Inn, and then drove me to this quirky little place called the Blue Swallow Motel. Whoever was following me, I just didn't want them to know where I was. Strangely enough, the Blue Swallow Motel was actually pretty cool, and I actually still have some pictures that I took of it before I actually went to bed. I spent the rest of my day sleeping and was planning on getting a ride back to the hotel early in the next morning to get my truck and then driving to meet Jean in the morning. I woke up at about 4 and I was feeling a little better, and the police said that they would take me to my truck, which I was very thankful for. While I was on the phone with them, I looked out the window of my room, and there was that friggin' white car in the parking lot. I didn't freak out this time. I calmly told the police that the car was there, and they said to stay put. But just as if he had heard me, the car lights came on, and it tore out of the parking lot. I wanted out of this so bad at this point and was beyond shaken up. I wanted to either go home or be in San Francisco with my friends. The police came, others were driving around looking for the car and driver, but I insisted I needed to get out of there. A police car followed me for quite a while once I got back on the interstate, and nothing happened for the rest of my drive to Albuquerque. I went to the airport in the morning, Jean got there, and then we drove non-stop to San Francisco. About a week later, I was cleaning out the back of my truck when I found a piece of paper folded up. I thought it was just a piece of garbage for my trip, but I opened it anyway, and inside, written in crude, kid-like letters, was the message, "You got lucky. I have to go home." I ran inside my friend's apartment and showed it to her, and we called the police. There was obviously nothing much they could do about it, but they said they'd let the Tucumcari police know about it. That was the town that I had stopped in New Mexico. They did ask for it, and I gladly gave it to them after taking a picture of it. I didn't want that hanging around. So yeah, that was a messed up drive, and I will never drive cross-country again, even if I'm with people. I'll fly next time. I try not to think about it, but when my mind does wander to those days, I'm terrified as to what that person was planning on doing to me. It's scary to think about it, even to this day. My brother and I worked at a pizzeria in our little town in upstate New York in the early 90s. He was a delivery guy, and I was a pizza slinger, getting my gnarly burns and scars from bumping into the oven doors my moron coworkers would leave open behind me. It was an okay job. Free food, and at the end of each night, the managers would let us drink beer while we cleaned up for the day shift the next day. I was 16 at the time. The owner also looked the other way because we always went out of our way to prep and clean so the other crew didn't have to rush before the lunchtime slam. One night, my brother got sick and had to go home, but he was the only delivery guy on, so he asked me if I would take over for the night. He said I could keep all the tips, and he'd throw me an old amp and a head unit for my car if I'd do it. Plus, I got to drive his car for the night, and I loved his car. It was an '86 Regal that he had dropped a 3.8 into with a turbocharger, almost a Grand National. That car was the cat's ass. Sorry about the backstory, but it is important later. My manager said okay, as we had 2 other guys in the kitchen and they could handle things. I took my brother home, went back to the shop, and got ready for my first run. The night went smoothly with everything, and my manager was saying I was quicker than my brother and that he was going to fire him, and we laughed, and I said I'd be sure to tell him that. It was just about midnight, and we stopped delivery with orders at that time, but the shop remained open for dine-in and takeout. I had one more run and could go home, but I told the guys I'd be back to help clean and prep. Not just for a couple of more hours of pay, but the thought of a few beers on a Saturday night was too good to pass up when I was 16. I had 4 deliveries to do on my run, and 3 were right in town, but one was on the opposite side and on the edge of our town. I decided to hit up the close ones first as they had also ordered earlier, and then I was going to cruise out to the country, have a smoke, and just relax. I scored some really nice tips, as was usual for deliveries made that late at night, as people were more inclined to be a little saucy at the time. Happy as a clam, I hopped in the car after the 3rd delivery and made my way out to the last stop of the night. The house I had to go to was one of the only ones out there. Back then, that part of our town was very rural, with houses spaced far apart. Now it's all subdivisions. Sorry, I know I'm rambling. I saw the mailbox on the road with the right number, and I pulled into the long driveway. There were no lights on except the one at the side door, and there was one light on upstairs in a room, and it was like a red light bulb or something. I thought weird, but I got the pizza out of the warmer bag and went to the door and rang the bell. No one came to the door. I rang again, and then I heard an intercom click and a woman's voice say, "Pizza? Oh, come on in." There was another clicking noise and then silence. I found the little speaker and pushed the button next to it, and the voice came on again and said, "Pizza?" I answered back, "Yes, but I can't come inside. It's 9:50. The voice replied, "Okay." As I looked through the window of the door, I saw a small set of stairs that led up to a hallway, and as I looked, I saw a person walk by the door. Well, actually, they were crawling on his or her hands and knees. I thought that was a little odd, but maybe the people inside were playing a game or something. I waited for a couple of more minutes, but nothing happened. So I hit the little button again, and the voice once again said, "Pizza?" At this point, I was getting testy, and I said, "Yeah, 9:50. I heard a noise from around the back of the house, like a door opening, so I thought maybe there was an issue with the side door or something. Then the light on the side of the house went out, and I glanced up and down the driveway, now on alert. Another sound from the back of the house made me turn my head, and out from the corner came this person who just stood there looking at me. It was dark, and my eyes were trying to adjust, kind of being blinded by the light now that it was gone. 9:50? I called out feebly. The figure just stood there, and then I could make out that they were raising their hand and pointing towards me, or rather to the side door. I turned and looked into the door glass, and there was another person there standing there, leaning against the glass, wearing a leather mask with a zipper over the mouth. I jumped back startled, and the intercom came back on, and the woman's voice asked again, "Pizza?" I said, "Fuck this," as the figure at the backyard started walking towards me, and the side door started to open. I backpedaled to the car, and thank God I left my door open. I just threw the pizza on the floor, slammed my door shut after jumping in, and took off. Suddenly, a set of vehicle lights blazed to life in front of me, and I could see the person who was inside was now with the other one, and they began walking towards me. I jammed it into reverse and gunned it back to the road and popped out onto it. I looked to my left, and they were still coming with what I saw was a pickup truck right behind them. Never have I been so happy to hear that high-pitched whine of a turbocharger at that moment when I lit up that car's tires and got the hell out of there. I was so happy to be in my brother's car. That slide and then the jolt of rubber catching is something I'll never forget. I sped up the road back towards a main drag where there was a traffic light, but that was about 2 miles away. I looked into the rearview mirror and saw the lights come out onto the road and then up after me. There was a blinking red light, a four-way stop that I had to get to first, and it was also a known spot for cops to hang out for speeders. But of course, that night there was no one there. I was going back and forth in my mind about what to do. It wasn't my car, and I didn't want to get into an accident, but I was also totally freaked out by these wackos in the truck behind me. I stopped for the blinking red light, and they almost caught up with me, and in the glow of the light, I could see 2 people in the truck, and the other 2 people standing up in the back of the truck. I jammed through the intersection, and they blew right through it. It was pretty much a straight shot to the main drag, with a pretty gnarly S-turn in the middle, and I said out loud, "Sorry, Marco," and that's my brother's name, and I hit the gas. The Buick took off like a rocket, and I was dusting those fools. I took the S-curve like Mario Andretti, and I knew they would never be able to pull that off in a truck. I was up to about 115 miles an hour, and by the time I got to the light, which was green, thank God, they were way behind me. I cut the corner knowing I'd be pulled over if there was a cop out, but I was alone, and I just jammed back to the shop and slid into the parking lot. I jumped out of the car, and I ran to the door and yelled for my manager, who just happened to be right by the door. He looked at me startled and ran over and asked what was up, and I just grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him outside, just in time to see the truck with the guys driving by the shop and looking over at both of us. My manager asked what the hell was going on, and I told him the whole story. We went back inside and he called the cops. They came out and I told them what had happened, and the cop left with another cop to go check out the house. I sat down shaking, and I had a smoke waiting for them, and they came back in about a half an hour. There was no one at the house. It was locked up, and when they checked with a neighbor who had heard me peel out, had come over when he saw them at the house, he had said that the house was vacant and had been for about 6 months. No one was supposed to be there at all. The cops made a report, but nothing ever happened, and of course, I never saw those guys or that truck again. When I got home, I apologized to my brother for beating on his car after telling him what had happened, and he just laughed and said, "Hey, that's what that car is for, man, making a fast getaway." I have no idea if those guys were just trying to scare me or were having fun, or if they had other intentions. It's been so many years, though, honestly, I try not to think about it. Recently, a friend and I began talking about hauntings. I hadn't known him for very long, but as we were getting to know each other, we talked about whether we believed in ghosts. Since I work in a haunted location, that's another story, I told him that I did, and he told me about the house that he lives in. And of course, I had to have a look for myself, particularly as an amateur paranormal investigator. To start with, he told me that an elderly relative of his who owned the house and passed away in it from natural causes remains in the house. She doesn't like it when people leave lights on or appliances on and will often turn them off if they are left unattended. She is generally quite good-natured, but if someone unfamiliar to her doesn't follow her house rules, she's been known to show her displeasure. For example, she absolutely hated people smoking in the house, especially as she was a non-smoker herself. Should anyone smoke within the walls of the house, she tended to do things like hide their lighters or cigarette packs from them. They would then be found in really strange locations, like in the bathroom sink or in front of the back door, almost as though she was trying to hint towards shooing someone out the door. She would occasionally call out, usually during the night, and normally a greeting, like a hello. As long as someone she was familiar with was in the house, she was generally known to be a happy presence. When it's only people who are strangers to her, she appears to try and ward them off, but aggressively turning lights on and off, rattling doors and windows, that kind of thing. She was such a strong woman when she was alive, it would appear as though her strength kept the original spirits in the house at bay. She would talk to them in her native tongue, which was French. When necessary, she would occasionally raise her voice and almost sound like she was warning them off. As my friend doesn't actually speak French himself, he couldn't really tell what she was saying, except sometimes when she would swear at them. As her health began to deteriorate, it would appear as though the spirits in the house would then gain some strength, and she wasn't able to control them quite so much. My friend told me that once she had passed away, the spirit activity increased significantly. He's not sure if it was initially her spirit or those of the original inhabitants of the house. It isn't known exactly who the other spirits in the house are, only that they don't appear to appreciate people being in their space. One night, my friend awoke and found 4 human figures standing around his bed. Frightened, he closed his eyes but opened them back up. But the spirits were still there. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but he got the feeling that they were very aware of him and were trying to intimidate him. The original idea behind their existence in the house was because when his relative bought the house, a certain area underneath the floorboards had been dug up and re-cemented. His relative would often joke that maybe somebody buried a body down there. But despite extensive searches, no origin story for these spirits has ever been conclusively proven. The spirit's main target lately seemed to be his new housemate, and he would often wake to the sensation of someone sitting down on the edge of his bed, and then a freezing cold chill in the room. He would hear someone talking out in the kitchen, down the other end of the house, and then calling out in an aggressive tone, as though they were mad, and he would only hear this when he was home alone. Both my friend and his housemate hear the sounds of something being dragged down the hallway, and heavy footsteps thumping towards their rooms all the time. It doesn't seem to matter whether there is only one or both of them at home. It happens at random a lot of the time. Sometimes several nights in a row, and sometimes it hasn't happened for a month. The dragging sound also occurs outside the bedroom windows, as though someone is dragging a heavy bag of something through the backyard. My friend has a nephew who also stays at the house sometimes, and his nephew has reported to him that sometimes objects will be moved in front of him, like the television remote control and his glasses. He says that sometimes they try to talk to him, although he has never said exactly what they've whispered, only that it scares him and he doesn't want to talk to them. He says that sometimes he sees a man standing in the hallway. It doesn't appear to move or react to being seen. This man just stands there until the nephew looks away, and then he's no longer there once he looks back. So, based on what my friend told me and my love and experience with the paranormal, I asked him if I could stay over for a night or two with some equipment and do a little investigating. He agreed, and before I knew it, there I was, standing in his lounge room, holding a tape recorder and asking questions. I began with asking who was in the house and why they were there. Almost immediately, I had a voice come through saying the name John. There was little in the way of further communication using this method. The only exception was when I asked why they liked to sit down on the end of the housemate's bed in the middle of the night, and the housemate's name was repeated twice. So I decided to change my investigation a little and tried baiting them by reenacting an event that both occupants of the house told me often triggers activity: having a shower. It had been mentioned to me by both of them that they would be having a shower, and as they opened their eyes after rinsing off their face, they would see a dark figure on the other side of the shower screen. While this wasn't really something I wanted to experience, I wanted proof for myself that the house was haunted, even if it wasn't proof I could hold in my hand. So I undressed and ran the shower. After climbing in and beginning to wash, I got the distinct feeling that I was being watched. As my friend had left the house to collect dinner, I knew it wasn't him. I thought perhaps it was just my nerves getting the better of me, so I continued with the shower. I rinsed my hair and was about to turn off the water and get out, when I heard a very quiet but definite sound of the handle on the door of the bathroom creaking, as though someone was opening the door. I opened my eyes and looked through the screen towards the door and saw a flash of darkness, almost like a shadow running through the room. It was enough that it temporarily blocked out the whiteness of the towel that was hanging on the back of the door. I quickly got out of the shower, stepped out in a hurry to get dry. As I did so, I heard my friend arrive home and call out. After I dried and dressed, I went out to greet him, and he said that he thought he saw a man standing in the window as he pulled into the driveway, and wanted to know if his housemate had returned home. We thoroughly checked the house, then called the housemate. He was at a movie at the time, so we were sure it hadn't been him. Fast forward to later that evening. I was resting on the couch with my eyes closed, nervously trying to sleep. There was a dim light in the room as the kitchen light had been deliberately left on, as I was anxious about sleeping in the house in complete darkness. I managed to doze off after an hour or so. I kept stirring. My sleep was restless, and I finally managed to fall asleep properly. I woke up around 4:20 a.m., woken by the sound of someone calling out in distress. As I opened my eyes, I saw the figure of a man standing in the hallway, looking at me. He didn't move. He didn't say anything, but I could hear the sound of someone breathing heavily, as though they were enraged by something. I sat straight up and couldn't take my eyes off of the figure in the hallway. I began to shake as I was scared, and I decided to call out to my friend and see if he was awake. As I called out to him, he turned on his bedroom light, which was down the other end of the hallway where I had seen the figure. The figure disappeared as soon as I turned the light on, and my friend came out into the hallway to check on me. I decided I wasn't going to be able to sleep anymore, and I figured I might as well leave, as I was quite shaken by the incident. As much as I had expected something paranormal to happen, I didn't expect to feel threatened or endangered as I had. As I was packing up my things and getting ready to go, my friend and I were talking about what I had seen and heard. We both heard the sound of someone chuckling quickly, as though they had delighted in scaring me. I left the house in a hurry. My friend continues to live there for now. I haven't returned, and I vowed that I won't. I am clearly not wanted in that house on Bindery Crescent, Ingle Farm. This happened over 10 years ago now, so let me set the stage. At the time, I was in middle school and lived in the suburbs of SoCal, so crime wasn't something to worry about. So safe that our parents let us have the whole come home when the streetlights turn on rule that many households had. We also lived right next to a bunch of canyons, which were just fragmented patches of undeveloped land that had tons of brush and bushes in them, that acted as our place to explore and make forts in and whatnot. It was the weekend, and my brother and I had been playing a ton of Borderlands at the time, and my mom wanted us the hell out of the house, so she made us go for a run around the Loop. The Loop was basically just this path to run when you wanted to get a good 2 or 3 miles in while also doing some hills. It all encompassed part of our neighborhood, creating a sort of loop. We groaned, said fine, and put on our running gear. The beginning of the run was fine, just chatting and goofing off while walking every once in a while since we weren't super stoked about heading up a huge hill. At the top of this hill, the street bends and then connects with a more main road, so there's typically more traffic. As we were going, I saw a white truck turn down the street ahead of us. The same street that we were about to also turn onto to keep doing the loop. Of course, I think nothing of it at the time. It's not until later that I see another white truck past us, and I get a kind of glitch in the matrix like deja vu. After the next 2 times a white truck passes, I realize it's not a bunch of trucks, just the one. The same one that turned off the main road to ours before. I think it's weird, but I figure maybe they're lost or just driving around looking at houses, which wasn't uncommon considering it was a pretty nice area. But as we keep going, I notice that there's a white truck parked on the side of the road, and then it clicks. This truck has been driving past us, parking on the side of the road, waiting for us to pass while hiding in plain sight, and then driving farther down the road out of sight before parking again. By now, I still had some doubt that this truck was actually following us, so I waited until we passed it to see if it would follow us again. We were at the bottom of the loop at this point, with canyon on our left and right. The one to our right was a state park with biking trails and hiking paths, but much more expansive and separated from houses. My brother and I hadn't explored that one, but we knew the canyons on our left like the back of our hand. We had spent countless days and weekends exploring them, making forts, carving labyrinth-like paths through them, so we felt very comfortable there. It was our home away from home, and we felt like we could evade any pursuer in those twisting trails of bushes and rocks. At this point, I heard a car coming up from behind us, and I waited until it was just about to pass us to look at it. I turn, confirm that it's the white truck, and get a good look at 2 middle-aged men in the front seat. They were white, one with black hair with a beard and one with gray hair and stubble, and they were staring directly at us as they passed. At this point, without breaking eye contact with the truck and watching it go past us down the road, I tell my brother, "That white truck's following us. Once it goes around the bend, we are cutting through the canyon to go home." He agreed, and the moment the truck was out of view, we bolted into the canyon and booked it back to our house, where we told our mom what had happened, and she called the police. The police showed up and asked us for a description, and told us that going into the canyon was, number one, the worst thing to do, as we had no way of knowing how capable the men could have been on foot, and two, we should have just knocked on any random house's door to get help. We didn't know any better. Soon, there was a helicopter going all over the neighborhood looking for a truck that matched our description. They didn't catch anyone since the description was so broad. They also told us not to worry about it in the future, since the helicopter and the fact that we got away from them should have scared them off, and they would likely go someplace else. But still, spooky as hell. We never saw them again, but had plenty of other weirdos follow us around in the canyon and the like. But to the two guys following around middle school boys in your weird truck, let's not meet. This story is hard to explain, but nevertheless true. I live in Australia on a farm, and I'm 18 now, but this story happened about 2 years ago when I was 16. A friend had come over to my place, but left, and I was all alone, and it was just me and my two dogs, going on around 5 or 5:30. I was just chilling, watching TV and playing games, but I got super bored like I always do after playing them for a couple of hours. My parents were out, my younger brother was at a friend's place, and my nan, who lives next to us in a little granny flat, she was out too, getting her hair cut. There aren't too many places good close to where I live, so you have to walk quite some distance before going on a half-decent walking track that you would actually be able to enjoy. Stupid me, I thought, well, I'm bored. I went for a walk, only before it got dark in about 2 hours. Skip ahead like a half hour of walking. I finally hit a trail that I like to walk to clear my head, and it was a trail that has two ways to go, one to a river that has a few large rocks you can sit on and just watch the river flow, and another way which leads to another spot on the river. I went down the first track and sat on these rocks looking at my iPhone while watching the river as well. I was there for maybe 10 or 20 minutes, and then I decided to head back. As I was going back up the track, I saw a bag on the ground, and I was super curious because that wasn't there when I went down. Anyway, I went over to it to check it out, and I heard something behind me, like something was coming from behind, and I gotta admit, I freaked out and started running as hard as I could, and I'm actually quite fit, so I can sprint quite some distance. I finally reached the start of the track, and noticed it was getting darker and darker, and that's when I checked my phone and realized I only had half an hour to go before I got home, before I knew I would be in trouble. I know this area very well, so I know all the shortcuts. And while I was at the start of the trail, just catching my breath, I looked behind me, and this man, a little shorter than me and quite tubbier, came up behind me, and he said that he would give me money and a new iPhone if I came with him. I replied, "I'm good, thanks, maybe another time." But he said, "Come on, it's all for free." Before I could talk again, he said, "Hey, what's a good-looking fella like you doing out here by yourself?" And I just said, "Going for a walk?" He reached into his bag and pulled out what looked like something you would hold a stray dog down so you could detain them, and I freaked the fuck out and ran harder than I ever had before. I could hear him chasing me, saying, "Wait, wait!" And I said, "Fuck off, you creep." I finally got home and it was super dark. I actually had to use my phone's torch to make it the rest of the way home, and when I went inside, I told my dad everything, and he said, "You're okay. You're probably imagining things," and then he told me to go to my room and calm down, and hey, you should have been home a half hour ago. So I went to my room and slept the rest of the night. I've always been the first one to wake up in the morning, and I like to go outside and take a piss in the paddock while taking a look around even though it gets super cold. I didn't mind because I was kind of used to that. So I got to the front gate, and the lock, which is usually on, was snapped off. I ran back to the house and told my dad, and he grabbed his shotgun, and we went around the property looking for things, but we found nothing, and he said, "Yeah, that is kind of strange, but it could be some of the teenagers around just being dicks." As we headed back to the house, I said to him, "Hey, look, over there in the bush, beside the gate." The man that I saw the day before was hiding there, and he was there the entire time, especially when I was at the gate, and he could have grabbed me. My parents would never have known. Dad ran towards the front gate with the gun, but by then the guy had jumped into his car and driven off. So Dad took a potshot at the car and took out its back window. We called the police and told them everything, and Dad asked if he was going to be in trouble. The policeman said no worries, as it was classed as self-defense and a breach of property protection. But what creeps me out is the police had found a dog tranquilizer syringe right where this guy had been standing in the bushes. They caught this guy a year later due to an investigation, but it scares me if he had got any kids and what he had done to them. P.S. I have a knife now to protect me. Crazy Road Trip, submitted by Heru Black. Here's something that happened to me and two other friends a couple of years back. Sorry it's so long, but it takes place over the course of a week. It was a pretty messed up road trip, and we didn't realize how scary it was until a few years later, because the entire time we were very, very high. It was March 2014, and my friends and I'll call them Steve and Karen, had just started a band together. I'm a guy who was pretty outgoing and friendly, and Steve was a quiet kid who was pretty masculine, or at least thought he was. He came from a suburban town in Cape Cod where he was valedictorian and also the class clown. Karen was a small, dirty blonde, pretty shy and quiet, but very friendly. An ex-scene kid like me, we both had hair over our eyes. Steve and Karen were in the beginnings of a relationship. We were in college and spring break was coming up soon. We had no plans, so we decided we were going to drive from Massachusetts to Florida to do some camping in some national forests, and then drive to New Orleans if we had the time. We weren't really experienced campers or road trippers, but we were depressed 19-year-olds who felt pretty invincible and had nothing better to do, so we figured, what the hell. That Sunday night, Karen had gotten us our first show in her home state of Connecticut, and I'm pretty sure we left right after. The ride down was nice, but an exhausting 24 hours. We got to Florida on Monday night around 1 a.m., tired as hell. We were so tired, and we'd been smoking, we didn't even try to find a campground. We pulled over and set up the tent in a slightly wooded area about 10 feet off the road. When we woke up and left the tent, we realized we'd actually been camping in a ditch, which we thought was pretty funny. We made it our goal that day to find a real campsite. Of course, we'd been smoking, and while we were at a gas station, Karen decided she was just going to go into the convenience store and ask people about any good camping spots. She came out having spoken to two rednecks who said they could lead us to some really good spots. Again, we were pretty high and thought, hey, this is great. The locals will definitely show us the best spots. We followed their pickup truck, smoking a bit more, until we ended up in the woods near a slow, shallow river. We got out, and they started telling us about what a great campsite this was in their thick hick accents. We've got a lot of firewood, they said. We've been cutting it up, and we'd be happy to share it. You can swim right over there, but don't go out too far. There's gators out here. They were really trying to sell us this campsite. I thought the shorter redneck was kind of hot, chubby with a beard. You can ask my friends. I'm pretty much a bad man detector. If you think a guy is attractive or get a crush on one, you should run far away. I went up to Steve while they were talking to Karen about sharing food or something. We should, tell them we're going to go get firewood or something and just not come back, I said. He agreed, too high to remember the firewood they just offered to share with us 10 minutes before, and we used that same excuse. In the car, Karen said she'd been feeling weird about the way they were talking to her too, and was glad we'd come up with some way to slip away. Wouldn't it be so funny if we looked back and they were just following us? I said, trying to be funny. Don't even fucking joke about that, Karen said. Then I said, "Guys," looking back. Sure enough, there was the dirty old pickup truck, not 50 feet behind us. Super freaked out, we drove around making a lot of sharp turns. They kept up, though stayed at a distance. It had been a few hours of us frantically driving, and the sun had set, and we thought we'd lost them in the dark. It was probably around 10 at night or so when we found a campground you had to pay for, but we couldn't find anywhere to pay, so we just drove in, found a nice spot, and set up camp. We hadn't actually gotten any firewood, so super high, Karen and I set out into the dark to find anything we could burn. We kept joking about how the rednecks were going to jump out and get us, but Karen really started freaking out, saying, "Oh my God, we're so far from the campsite. We're lost. We're never going to find our way back, and the rednecks are going to find us and kill us." I reassure her and say, "Dude, we're literally 20 feet from the car. Look, the trees aren't even that thick. We can still see it." Yeah, we were high. We gathered a bunch of logs and some branches from trees that kind of looked like palm trees but were short and grew like bushes. We got back and Steve had already started the fire with things that he'd found, so we broke out some sausages and cooked them over the fire and drank an entire bottle of wine. Extremely hungover, we got some groceries in the morning, and I got sick after eating an entire thing of birthday cake Oreos. Just before sunset, we found another campsite on the outskirts of the Ocala forest, about 100 feet from a road. We could see car headlights going by through the trees, and there were occupied campsites around, so we felt pretty safe. We smoked some more, made some food, and I was surprised I could still get some cell service, and I used the super slow internet on my phone to look up scary stories specifically about the Ocala forest. I found some stories about the Rainbow People, a supposed cult that lived in the Ocala forest and tried to make other people live there too. It didn't seem that scary, so we were disappointed after having waited about 10 minutes for the website to load. But suddenly, we heard a creak in the woods, just outside the light of the fire. We didn't think much of it until we heard a bunch more, all around us. It sounded like footsteps on the leaves. As always, very high, we started freaking out. We didn't think the rednecks would have followed us this far, but we still weren't sure, and having just watched the Blair Witch Project together a few weeks before, I joked, maybe it's the Ocala Witch. Steve told us to wait at the fire while he went to the car and turned the headlights on. Karen and I stood back to back with our pocket knives out, still not knowing if we were freaking out for no reason. Once Steve got the headlights on and drove closer to us, we got in and he did some donuts while we looked around to make sure everything was clear. When we were sure there wasn't anyone there, we joked more about this Ocala witch and decided it was time to just go to sleep. We poured some water on the fire and got in the tent. We'd been laying in our sleeping bags for about 10 minutes when we noticed some light to the side of the tent. Our fire had started back up, and we were pretty freaked out since we dumped most of our water on it. The fire started to grow, and it got pretty big. "Is anybody going to go check on the Ocala witch?" I said, looking over to Karen and Steve, who both looked at me and nodded no. Too scared to leave the tent, we eventually fell asleep. And we woke up, the fire pit was still smoking, and it was completely ash. I mean, maybe it's explainable, but we were pretty scared at the time because some of the ash was a very distinct shade of blue. Steve tied some sticks together into figures and put them around the campsite to freak us out while we were packing up. Real funny. That night, we decided to go deeper into Ocala. We were driving around the forest looking for a camping spot while I was reading stories about the skunk ape that I'd loaded onto my phone in advance. Of course, we were still smoking, and it was pretty late, really dark, and we were tired. We started to think we might have gone too deep to find a campsite, but the path was wide enough for a car, so why wouldn't there be a good spot? We came upon a line of cars in the middle of the forest, mostly looking pretty broken down with some graffiti on them. We kept going, and soon there were a bunch of people walking around. We drove up to one of them, a very tall, very bearded man who could have been the skunk ape himself. Rolling the window down just enough to talk to him, I asked, "Hey, what is this?" "A gathering," he said abruptly, with a really deep voice. "Of what?" I asked, confused. "Of people." We'd managed to stumble upon the Rainbow Gathering, the cult we read about the night before. Turns out, they were just hundreds of hippies living in the woods and were very hospitable. One guy, whose name I can't remember, decided to show us around, and he was really nice and introduced us to a bunch of people. The greeting and farewell was, "Lovin' you." He introduced us to his wife, who was pregnant with their 7th child. Everyone, again, was really nice. They taught us all about how they lived in the woods. If you got lost at night, you yelled, "Hey, I need an adult!" and someone would come find you. If you needed tobacco, you yelled, "Nick at night!" and there was a group that would come and give you some. They called lighters fire dragons, the outside world Babylonia, and didn't trade with money, which they referred to as Babylonian tickets, but rather they traded shiny rocks and pretty stuff. We were really high and having a lot of fun. They got us some food and took us to a drum circle, and they were all over the forest, sometimes 10 or 15-minute walks between sites. We knew it was a little weird, but we decided to go along with it. At one point, an old guy had Karen in his lap next to a bonfire, sipping on some mystery liquid from a thermos, but she seemed happy, so we didn't think much of it. We also met the one black hippie who was there, who only beatboxed, and he never spoke. We hung out with them for a couple of more hours before we got tired. There were different camps throughout the forest, and our guide led us to his, which was called Camp Shut the Fuck Up. It was the quiet camp for all the parents with kids. We set up our tent and went to sleep. I woke up first and read a book in the tent since it was raining. By the time Karen and Steve woke up, the rain had stopped, and we went to hang out with some of the people at Camp Shut the Fuck Up. We talked with them for a little while and listened to their stories. Someone was talking pretty casually about how a girl had been dosed at another camp, and she was going crazy or something. We figured out through the context clues that dosed meant someone had given her a large amount of acid without her knowledge, and she understandably freaked out. We realized how weird the whole thing was and decided it was time to pack up and leave. As we were taking down the tent, we started to hear it. "You're doing it wrong." We heard people chanting. Not in unison, but randomly, one after another. We looked back, and there were a few people walking towards us. "You're doing it wrong," they kept shouting. We continued to dismantle the tent while one of them approached us. "You guys are packing up after only one night?" Karen replied, "Yeah, we want to get to New Orleans today." The guy replied, "No, you guys should stay longer. We've been living here for months. Gotta stay away from Babylonia. All that shit rots your brain." When we weren't receptive, they started getting more aggressive. "Check out these Babylonians. You're doing it wrong." I looked at him and said, "Dude, we have to be back at school in like 3 days." Someone from the back of the growing group of hippies between us and the path of Camp Shut the Fuck Up yelled out, "Quit school! Come live in the woods with us!" Someone else shouted, "Someone get the duct tape!" Karen got mad and started arguing with them about us going to school. They were saying that we weren't doing anything by going to Babylonian school. And Karen argued that we were going to school so we could learn what we needed to actually make change in the world instead of just sitting in the forest and doing acid and littering. Finally, after what seemed like an hour with all these people yelling at us, we finished packing up the tent, and Karen had convinced some of them that we were on the same side and just doing it different ways. I think she just outsmarted them, really. They let us through, and our guide let us out of the forest, apologizing for the rest of them. "You're lucky we didn't duct tape you to a tree," someone shouted. It was about a half-hour walk back to the car, and whenever someone saw us with all of our gear, they shouted, "You're doing it wrong," or "Hey, have fun in Babylonia." We finally got to the forest entrance, and we met our guide's wife again, still very pregnant. She looked each of us in the eyes, smiled at us, and put her hands on our shoulders, and hugged us as if to say, "I'm glad you're getting out. I wish I could too." We drove to a park on the coast where manatees were supposed to swim, but I guess it was the wrong time of the year, so we just drove through a weird suburban island town before heading to New Orleans. We got there pretty late, and we were again exhausted. We couldn't find anywhere to set up camp because we were in a city, and we didn't really think this through. We found a lawn between a stadium and its parking lot, and Steve wanted to sleep in the tent, but Karen and I thought it was too cold and we should just sleep in the car. Steve still set up the tent, determined to sleep in it, and because they were kind of together, Karen decided she would too. I woke up to a flashlight blinding my face and someone banging on the window. I open the door and instantly the alarm goes off. There's 2 cops standing there, bewildered, asking me where the keys were so I could turn off the alarm. And I pointed to the tent about 10 feet away. Meanwhile, in the tent, the alarm had woken Steve and Karen up, and they thought someone had broken into the car. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I was in it, they would have been too scared to come out of the tent. However, they unzipped the tent with their knives ready, only to see the 2 cops. The cops called them over, asked to see all of our IDs, and asked what we were doing so far from home. We told them that we just didn't have anything else to do for spring break. They ran our IDs, and they said it was cold and that Steve and Karen could go back to the tent and I could go back in the car while they did it. Okay, I'm black and frequented Tumblr, where I had heard about police brutality and the latest minority killing by a cop on a daily basis. Oh God, we're in Louisiana. They're separating us because they're going to shoot me, I thought. Steve and Karen back in the tent had similar thoughts. They knocked down the window and called my friends from the tent, and luckily they didn't kill me. They told us to be safe, and then they went on their way. The rest of the trip was fine. We walked around New Orleans and hung out with some homeless travel kids on a pier. I bought them whiskey, and we thought it was funny that I was the only one that didn't need a chaser. Just as the sun was setting, we took off to make the day-and-a-half drive back home. And we made it back just in time to go to sleep and get up for school the next day. We were super lucky. I mean, the only reason we weren't more scared or observant was because we were high the entire time. A couple of years later, again, while high, we recounted the events to each other and realized just how dumb we'd been. We may laugh about it now, but there were so many times on that trip where things could have gone horribly wrong. The Pond, submitted by Skywalker. The summer before I went to college, my friends and I were hanging around on a Saturday night after we had gotten out of our burger or mall jobs. Safe for school, right? We were sitting in my backyard sipping beers and smoking cigarettes and just chilling out. This was in 2015, by the way, but not that it matters. There were 4 of us, EY, Bill, Tim, and me. My name is Dalton, and yes, my parents named me after that Patrick Swayze movie Roadhouse. Honest to God, that's my name. I'm using everyone's because I asked and they don't care. My parents were at my uncle's lake house, and I invited all the guys to crash at my place for pizza, beers, and a backyard fire. I think I was the only single guy, but I don't know where their girlfriends were or why they weren't hanging around like usual. Who knows? It was the beginning of August, and we were all talking about what we wanted to do before leaving our town for different colleges, except EY and me. We were going to the same place. I don't know how the subject came up, but we started talking about strange and creepy places in our town and the surrounding areas, and Bill said he always wanted to check out this pond that people said was haunted. We all saw it all the time. It was kind of right on an off-ramp of an interstate highway that ran on the west side of our town. Tim said he'd been out there once and it was bad news. His cousin lived next to the guy who owned the property where the pond was, and that there were posted and keep out signs all over the place. He went on to say that the guy had some kind of camera or something out there too, because when anyone ever went anywhere near the pond and a little dock that was there, he would either come roaring out on a four-wheeler or sneak up on people with a shotgun and threaten them to leave. Tim's cousin had also said a young girl had drowned out there when we were younger, and that was probably the reason the guy didn't want anyone around. We didn't even know if that was true, though. At any rate, the stories people would tell about going out there always told the tale of this dead girl coming out of the water, and some of the stories said she would scream and point at whoever was there. And that was when the landowner supposedly showed up and chased people away. It sounded kind of souped up, but we thought it was still pretty creepy. I mean, creepier than your run-of-the-mill haunted house stuff. So, what do we say after a couple of beers? Let's check it out. It was just past dusk, and while I went to fetch some flashlights and my Bowie knife, someone looked on their phone for a way to get to the pond without being noticed. We decided to park up the road from Tim's cousin's house. We called him, but no one answered the phone, and Tim thought he could remember the way over to the pond through the forest and stuff. We piled into EY's truck and drove out there, following the phone map and all laughing about what we would find and what we would do if some crazy came out at us. It didn't take long to get there, and EY parked, and we stayed on the road until we came to Tim's cousin's place. For good measure, he ran up and knocked on the door to see if anyone was home, and the dogs inside went crazy, but no one answered the door, so we knew no one was, and we knew the coast was clear. Tim led us on the edge of his cousin's back land that was just a huge open field that they mowed all the way to almost the end where the trees started. By now, Bill had flicked on his light, and so did I, and when we got to the back corner of the grass, there was a path going into the woods. Bill and Tim led the way, and after about 10 minutes we saw car lights. It was the off-ramp, so we knew we were close. I told Bill to kill his light, and I killed mine as the path led out of the trees and curved around to the right, closer between the trees and the road. And before we knew it, there was the big sign you could see from the interstate. Keep out. Private property. Just beyond it, we knew was the pond, and we could even see the island where the girl was supposed to appear. We all stood there just looking before deciding to be like Smokey and go over the line to the water. Tim went first, then me, then Bill, followed by EY. It was dead quiet. I mean that. No frogs, no crickets, not one thing stirring. And every once in a while we'd hear a truck or a car go by on the interstate, but that was it. It was our footsteps through the grass and an occasional "Dalton" or "Bill, shine a light over here" whispers. We went around the pond and saw the little dock and a shed-like building, and when we got closer to them, a wider path that ran off through the woods, I guess to the landowner's house or whatever. We all crouched down and just, taking it all in quietly. We didn't really know what else to do. I mean, it was just a pond at night, after all. After a few minutes, Bill said, "Okay, we saw it, let's go." He sounded nervous, which was kind of funny because he was the one who wanted to come out here. EY called him a chicken shit, and there was some giggling all around. The tension was broken, and we all stood up to make the walk back with our not very exciting story. And that's when it happened. Out over the water, by the island, came a light. It was the shape of a ball, and it was sort of circling around underwater, like if you've ever thrown a jumping jack firecracker in water. "What the hell?" said EY, and no one said anything. We just stood there watching it as it got closer to the surface. In less than 30 seconds, it broke the water with a little splash, and it got longer. I mean, that is taller. I'm not going to pretend to be able to say exactly how tall, but it did seem to be taking the shape of a little girl, I shit you not. Whatever it was, it kind of stood there wavering a bit, and when I say it was a light, it wasn't like this bright headlight kind of thing. It was just like a fading glow stick, but not green, just white. "All right, you guys, let's go," said Bill, who really was spooked at this point. Well, we all were, and it dawned on me that we still had to walk all the way around the pond to get back. I said, "Yeah, let's go." But then I felt a tap on my thigh on my knife, and a deep voice from behind me say, "And what are you going to do with that?" I almost shit my pants. We all kind of turned our heads, not our bodies, and something that was sitting there between me and Tim was the barrel of a rifle pointed at the water, held by a scruffy-looking man with a huge beard. I turned all the way around, about to say the standard, "Hey, we don't want any trouble," but he just pointed with his chin back at the water. "She's gone now. Never stays that long. That was my daughter. She drowned in here right after 9/11. She was only 6. It felt like 5 minutes had passed while we all just stood there. "Okay, boys, you saw her. Now get on the fuck out of here. You're all lucky I'm in a good mood and happy to see my daughter. Now go." We all mumbled sorry or whatever and shuffled away back towards the forest path. Before we got to the sign where we would turn back, we heard the guy yell, "Yo, you tell your friends to stay the fuck off my property, and don't you come back either." For emphasis, he fired a shot into the water, and let me tell you, we all noped the fuck out of there double time. We bombed through the forest, practically pushing each other out of the way, and ran until we got back to EY's truck. We jumped in without a word and tore back to my house. I mean, everyone ran inside, and we were all shaking. "Did that really happen?" asked Tim. And EY just said, "Fuck yeah, he fired that rifle." And Tim looked at him and said, "No, the other thing." I grabbed a beer and went out on the porch and kind of stood there thinking the whole thing over. The other guys finally came out, and we spent the rest of the night out there talking about what had happened. No one wanted a bonfire. We all wanted to be as close to the house as possible. We never told anyone what we saw out there other than that we had seen the pond and the guy came out to chase us away. We couldn't explain what we had seen, and I certainly didn't want people in my hometown thinking I was crazy. I did tell some people at a party last year, but that was it, and that was at college. Did we really see the ghost of a little girl out there that night? I don't know about these things, but I'm inclined to think we did. Beast was stalking us. Submitted by Be Prepared Just In Case. When I was 14, I was in the Scouts and working on merit badges with my friends Pete, Randy, and Dennis. We lived in a little town in West Virginia, so a lot of the things we needed to do for outdoors badges was a snap. All of us came up through Scouts together, and now we were in the same troop. I know lots of people have issues with scouting or think it's for dorks, but I made Eagle Scout, and I learned a lot about many things, and I have never regretted what I've done. Anyway, we were working on our camping merit badge and had 2 more nights to go to finish it off, so we decided to hike out to the mountains behind Pete's grandparents' house and have a weekend camping trip. It was the fall, but still pretty warm out that year, so we packed pretty light and planned on sleeping under the stars in our bags. Pete said he knew a place with a rocky outcrop that was flat and went into the side of a mountain so there would be an overhang too. It wasn't a cave, it was just a cut in the hill. Our parents dropped us off at Pete's grandparents with all the usual be safe jazz parents say, and we were ready to get going. It was a Friday afternoon, and we wanted to get to our camping spot fast so we could set up and get plenty of wood for a fire. Let me say this. Camping on your own when you're only 14 was such a big deal. Normally, we had a parent or two with us, but we were really good kids, and our parents trusted us to do the right things on our own, and we had a ton of freedom to do things just like this. We broke away from the older people, and Pete led the way to the place we were going to stay. It was about 3 miles away over a mountain, so it took some time to get there, and it was just as he described when we got there, a perfect place to camp. We looked over the duty list and everyone got to work on whatever chore they were assigned. I was fireman and cook that night, so I went to get water from a creek that was a few hundred yards back down the mountain, while the other guys set up camp and gathered a boatload of wood for the night's fire. Together, we got things organized and were laughing and joking the whole time while we made some camp crafts like a little table for preparing food and propping some logs up to use as benches around the fire pit. As it started to get darker, I had a fire roaring and was heating up water to make some soup, and we were roasting hot dogs over the flames. Dennis and I took the pot and cups from the soup back towards the creek to wash up afterwards, and we were making sure to do it far away from the actual stream to avoid contamination. By flashlight, we scrubbed everything clean and rinsed it all off in the dark and quiet of the woods. And then we heard it. A branch cracking very loudly a ways away from us. We looked at each other and I said, "If a tree falls in the woods," and we both laughed and got up to head back to camp. We stopped at the creek to get more water, and that's when we heard the knocking, like someone banging a heavy stick against another tree or something. That was weird. Dennis said we should get back to the other guys fast, and that's what we did. Pete and Randy were sitting by the fire talking when we came bursting back into camp and told them about what we had heard. "Probably just some animals, you guys," said Randy, and at that point we all agreed. We stayed up pretty late talking NFL and college football and chicks, and we finally got into our sleeping bags around midnight. When I woke up, the sun wasn't up that high yet, and everything had that bluish tint that mornings in the mountains always do. I loved and still love waking up in the woods. There's just something peaceful about it. Before the other guys woke up, I wrote down everything that we had done in my camp journal, and that's when I noticed something strange. We had left 2 propane lanterns on the makeshift table the night before we went to sleep, but now they were at different ends of the camp we had set up. I thought about it for a minute and figured one of the guys had put them there for a reason and just let it go. When the guys got up, I had no chores but offered to get water anyway while they got the fire and some grub going for breakfast. We had a good meal, and we were ready for some more bushcraft and a hike in the forest. I wanted a new walking stick, so my mission was to find the perfect one. As we wandered around, Dennis brought up the knocking sounds again, and then I asked about the lanterns. The guys all looked at me and said they didn't move them, so who did? That became the topic of discussion, and which one of us sleptwalked and actually moved the lanterns. I spied a stick that I thought would be perfect for walking, and that's when we came upon one of the strangest things I've ever seen. Where I saw my stick looked like some sort of shelter, but was really crude and just lots of heavy branches piled against a tree. "That's not an accident," said Pete. "That's there deliberately, and honestly, what a shit job they did of building a shelter." From one angle, it looked like a deadfall, but when we got closer, we could tell that the branches had been placed there with purpose. We talked about maybe another camper or hiker had built it quickly to get out of the elements, but didn't come up with anything solid. It was getting to be lunchtime, so we went back to the camp, and that's when we heard the first howl. We all stopped dead in our tracks. "What the hell was that?" I asked, and no one said a word. We listened, and again we heard it. It was far away, but we could hear it. At first it sounded like a deep air horn, but that certainly wasn't it. We waited in place to see if it would come again, but it didn't. We started walking again, and when we got to camp to make some sandwiches, Dennis was the first to say the word Bigfoot. "Oh, come on," said Randy. "There's no such thing as friggin' Bigfoot. What we heard was an animal or something. Give me a break." Dennis took offense to that, and I remember him going into all these books and TV shows he had seen about Bigfoot, that some of them build shelters and some use knocking as a method of communication, and they certainly can howl. "You know who sees Bigfoot?" said Randy. "People on drugs or people that want attention. Ever see a picture or a video of one that wasn't super fake or like the person was taking them wasn't having a conniption fit?" Everyone got into arguing about it, and the other guys were open to the idea of Bigfoot, which pissed Randy off. He asked me what I thought, and I told him I had no idea. That made him madder, and he went to get water from the creek. "You guys really think there's a Bigfoot out here?" I asked when Randy was out of earshot. "Maybe," said Dennis. "Why not? We've lived here all our lives and haven't seen a tenth of the mountains around our town. Who's to say there isn't something like that living out here?" "You think it's dangerous?" I remember asking. "Maybe we should go home." The guys didn't think so and said we shouldn't ruin the trip because of this, and besides, we really didn't know what was going on at all. Randy came back, and we let it go and just got to doing more scout stuff. That night, Dennis and Pete went to get water while Randy and I got the fire going. It was just dusk and starting to get darker when the two guys flew into our camp area breathing heavily as if they had just run up the mountain path with the water, which is exactly what they had done. "Oh my God, it's out there," said Pete in between breaths. "We are not kidding, man. Something is out there, and it's big." Randy told them to quit messing around and knock it off, but I realized they were really scared. I mean, really freaking out. Just then, we heard that howl again, and we all fell silent. "Guys," I said, "this is messed up." We all stood there looking at the fire and listening. "Let's get some food in us and chill out," I said. And we did, and kept an ear open for more noises. And sure enough, the howl came again. "Okay," said Dennis, "do we go home or what?" I said, "We have to go back exactly in the direction of where that sound is coming from." And everyone fell silent again. "Let's just stay here and get the fire really going," said Pete. "If it's a person, we can handle it. If it's something else, maybe the fire will scare it away." "Maybe it'll bring it closer," said Dennis. But he was outvoted, and we all built up the fire. It was dark by now, so we cranked it up and turned the lanterns on too. We tried to joke around and pretend nothing was wrong, but we were all pretty creeped out. Suddenly, a big branch came flying down from above us and landed on the edge of our camp area. We all jumped up, and there was a massively loud howl that felt like it was right in the camp. I took out my sheath knife and looked around wildly as a second branch came smashing down. "Get under the overhang," yelled Randy, and we dragged our bags and gear under it. The fire was at the edge of it, so while we were all scared, we still felt protected a little bit. Everything stopped. We all kind of just huddled there, barely talking, trying to hear if something else was coming. I got up to get more wood from our ample pile and put 2 logs on the fire. I remember standing in front of the guys about to say something when Pete yelled out and pointed at me. I spun around in time to see this gigantic black shape run right through our campsite and knock over one of the lanterns. This thing was huge. I was about 5'10" at the time, and this was well over 7 feet tall, and it stank. I mean, even while it was gone, it left an odor like a skunk rolled in garbage. I didn't say a word, but jumped back under the overhang with the guys, and all of us were visibly worked up. What are we going to do, you guys?" asked Dennis. "We're going to wait until morning and then make a break for it," said Pete. And we all agreed. I volunteered to stay awake and keep the fire going. It was all I could do to keep my composure and keep my mind off of what that thing was, and if it was coming back. The guys drifted off, and I looked at my watch. It was 1:30, and morning was a long ways away. I got up to get more wood again, and I cautiously looked around our camp area. I didn't see anything. I went to our pile, and as I picked up a couple more logs, I scanned around again, and there it was, in the dark on the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't scream or yell. I just stood looking at it. The lantern that had been knocked over was between it and me, and to this day, I can't say why I did this, but I did. I stepped over to the lantern, picked it up, and turned it off, all while staring at this giant thing that I thought could tear me from limb to limb. It made sort of a grunting noise, and just like that, it faded into the trees and was gone, and it never came back the rest of that night. In the morning, we cleaned up our spot, gathered up our stuff, and hurriedly made our way back to Pete's grandparents' house, where they made us a nice breakfast. We all swore to not say anything about what had happened and what we had seen. I never even told them about seeing the thing in the night while they were asleep. I don't live in West Virginia anymore, and I don't really talk about this at all. I found your channel and thought maybe you'd think it was interesting for a read. I made Eagle Scout, though, and I still have my medal. My friends have all gone their separate ways, and I don't really see much of them anymore. I do know Randy tells the story now. He never left our little town and has a drug problem, so no one believes his story he tells at the local VFW. The skeptics abound out there about things like this, but I know what we saw and what happened. We had many more trips in camping and scouting and otherwise, but I never saw anything like that again. Not the shelters, not the knocking, the howls, or anything. No matter what anyone says, I believe because I saw it. There is something out there in the mountains. What exactly it is, I can't say. But there is something out there.